Hello and welcome to this video on Neptune, a real salty sea dog of a Eurorack filter. This is from Winterbloom, a new company Decapod Devices. Let's check out what's to come. This demo video is sponsored by Winterbloom and Decapod Devices. Neptune is a diode ladder filter based on a design by Moritz Klein. And interestingly, rather than different filter type outputs, it has inputs to a low pass and a high pass stage. It has a single output where these inputs are always present. So with the cutoff, what's lower than the cutoff is what's in the low pass input, and what's higher than the cutoff is what's in the high pass input. So with different inputs, you can spectrally fade between them. With the same input to both, you can balance out their levels and do tilt EQ and different kind of dual band saturations. You can just use one side as a normal filter. And there's all sorts of interesting saturated, characterful or clean behaviours you can pull from this thing. The salt control routes the output through a full wave rectifier with some filtering and additional jiggery pokery, and that then controls the filter's cutoff. So it's a feedback, but not from output to audio input, but output to frequency control. And this allows for just gentle grit character saturation right through to all out chaos. We'll hear more about that salt design from Carson himself later in the video, but first let's hear some filtering from Neptune. So there's just some sounds quickly. I realise I haven't ran you through the features fully, so let's just run through them quickly. We have a low pass input and a high pass input with level controls. Unity gain is marked on the panel around 2 o'clock. You can push past that for saturation. We have our main cutoff control, and then an FM1 input with an attenuator, FM2 input with attenuator and a little mark to show where volt per octave tracking is. We have resonance with a CV control, and a mark on resonance to show where oscillation starts, and we get more harmonically rich pitch shifting resonance above that point. We have the salt control and the salt CV there, and we have a volume control, which is an onboard VCA at the output, and finally we have an output. So patching the same sound to both the low pass and high pass here, and an output from the filter. Let's start with some clean unity input low pass sweeps. Adding resonance. And resonance level will be affected by your level input. You can really choke out more aggressive resonance simply by slamming more input in and saturating that input stage. For some high pass filtering, we input to the high pass and turn that up. Again, we start really smooth with no resonance. And adding resonance. All those lovely croaky vocal characters. If we turn up both inputs, and this becomes similar to notch filtering, although the resonance is more like a peak EQ. It's like we're moving a peak, a resonant band around. The much anticipated, I'm sure, salt control. subtle at low levels, chaotic at high levels. Try that on the high pass. So those are some sounds from Neptune, and the timing index is on screen if you'd like to skip around. There's lots of patches to come. But before we dive into patches, I did interview Carson from Decapod Devices, and that full video is linked down below. But here's a bit of a kind of supercut just to show you and let you hear a bit from Carson before we dive into the patches. What led you into Eurorack?
Started out interested in synthesizers in Eurorack probably around 2016 or something like that. I was watching Look Mum No Computer videos on YouTube.
What was that time period between getting into some modules, buying your first modules, and then wanting to build? Have you any kind of electronics background that pushed things that way, or?
It turns out it's a lot harder than I thought at the time, but luckily I didn't know that at the time, so I kept at it.
Yeah. You don't know until you know.
Building the core fundamentals of a synthesizer, right?
Yeah.
And so the filter ended up becoming Neptune, and the oscillator I still have. You could probably see in my rack behind.
So that's Carson from Decapod Devices. Check out that below. We'll hear more from Carson when we get to the salt control section of the video. But without further ado, let's dive in. So here's Neptune as a characterful backend for a synth voice. So I'm thinking of Neptune here as the back end of a synth voice, in that by plugging in an oscillator, in this case a single saw wave, into the low pass input, we have a filter and a VCA to complete the audio path of a basic subtractive synth voice. The yellow cables and yellow trace on data here are my VCA envelope or volume envelope. And then the blue trace and blue cables is my FM for my filter. We can accent that with some resonance. And then using some stepped random signals, one of which is here on data. One of them is going to go to modulate the filter cutoff. So we get some dancing stepped random on top of the envelope modulation there. And adding salt, which is like a lovely character distortion in this case. I'm going to use stepped random to modulate the salt. And get these steppy kind of accents and kind of warm, round feedback distortions in the pattern. Back against the drums. So here we're using Neptune as a spectral crossfader. And it's changing and spectrally crossfading two different percussion parts. The kick and bass are entirely separate to Neptune. And here's the output of Neptune. Fading between two different inputs. On the high pass, we have this mix of clap, rimshots, 808 type percussion, and as you'd expect, that high passes with the cutoff knob. Now with the low pass, a totally different mix of percussion. So if this somewhere in the middle and both inputs. On the high pass side, you're listening to all the frequencies higher than the cutoff. And on the low pass side, whatever's at the low pass input, its frequency is lower than the cutoff. So notice how it's not a volume crossfade. You can hear this muffled low pass version fading in against the more prominent high pass input. You can just hear that high pass kind of whisper of this drum track. And somewhere around kind of 1, 2 o'clock on a clock face, we get a really nice blend of these two drum parts. Almost like DJ crossfading between tracks, with spectrally filter fading between two different mixes of percussion. So what actually is the salt feature?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a creative naming, but it's one of my favorite tricks that you can pretty much use with any filter. I think I might have saw it on one of your videos. I can't quite remember where it came from. Was taking the output of the filter and feeding it back into one of the CV inputs to modulate the cutoff frequency. With the resonance low, it kind of just adds a little bit of like a grit and an edge. But then when you turn the resonance up and, you know, put the cutoff in certain areas, it can get really wild and chaotic. And I like that aspect too. And there's a good bit of controllability there as well. Thinking about what you could do to sort of modify that to make it more interesting. The thing I thought of was to send it through a full wave rectifier. And there's a little bit of filtering and like stuff in there to keep it from swinging too wildly.
So here's how to give your module some seasoning and to salt over filters. As Carson's told us, salt is effectively feedback of the output back into the frequency modulation input with a full wave rectifier in the path, with some of a circuit jiggery-pokery, but we'll stick to the feedback and a rectifier. Here's the sound of a square wave, a sub-square out of Castor and Pollux, into the Joe filter. And then splitting the output in this splitter cable, one copy goes off to my mixer out of screen, and the other comes back into this attenuator and rectifier module, and coming back out of that into the CV. So as I turn this up, we have feedback of output to frequency modulation, which is pretty beastly. Small amounts of it just add some heft to the filter. But listen when I kick in the rectifier on this module. It's like a superpower for your filter tones. And when there's no resonance involved, almost gives like a unison, almost sounds like a big PWM on the input. I'm going to be salting everything in my system now. So here we have some delicate little pings and soft salty blurps. So these cables are currently just kind of hanging in the sockets. They're not actually in there, just for reference. The output is the only thing that's actually patched. Patching in a short envelope to trigger the high pass. I have the resonance set just on the edge of oscillation, which is how you set up a filter ping. Now the first thing I did was actually mix trigger inputs. I have a rhythm on this cable, a kind of rhythmic sequence if you like, but my straight 16th note clock I'm going to patch in as a trigger to the low pass. And can you hear we get this kind of double layer dynamic triggering? We'll leave the low pass down for now, and then add in a volt per octave, setting to this point where there's rough tracking marked on the panel. And we have this nice kind of cute little pinged filter sequence. Bringing a little bit of that background 16th note ping. Now adding some resonance modulation. This is a stepped sequence, the green trace here on data. Some notes ring that little bit longer. Adding some salt. All out. Blurps. So of course I want to modulate that in and out as well. And then the final thing I wanted to do was to control the volume with some AM modulation effects, amplitude modulation effects. So patching into volume here from this utility, I can offset the volume to just bring the level back up. And And then I have a high-pitched VCA level modulated signal, very much a kind of complete voice in itself, coming into the input here. And certain accents within the pattern. It's a different gate rhythm controlling this in the VCA. You can hear some steps have this higher frequency coming through and AM modulating, amplitude modulating. So here I'm using Neptune as a set of music production tools and effects. I'm using the volume modulation, the onboard VCA after the filtering stage to build a compressor. I'm using the low pass and high pass inputs to create this dual band tilt EQ. And I'm using modulation of the FM, the filter with some resonance, to create a nice phaser effect. So here's a drum loop. It's the same audio coming into both low pass and high pass here. The cutoff creates a split point between the audio, but as they're the same thing, you don't hear a difference. Just going into one or the other, of course you would hear the difference. And we can simply use the volumes of the low pass and high pass to create an EQ. If I boost or the low pass here, we can treat this like a big bass boost because it's everything below the cutoff. Then bring the sound back in. And as you can hear, we can get some really extreme low end enhancement. We could find a resonant point, trying to kind of saturate and elongate that kick. Mega soup kind of nuked bass drum sound. Likewise, you could do the same with the high end. Find a nice resonant point. Bring the lows back in. And then moving that cutoff around creates phaser-like filter sweeps. I have an envelope follower over this beat coming into a utility. I'm inverting the envelope and offsetting it. So as I plug into volume, which cuts off the sound, I'm offsetting it back open again. And then I'm negatively bringing down this envelope that's following the beat in an external envelope follower. We can use that VCA to get nice compression, in this case extreme compression effects. If we went the other way and started with no offset and positively added this envelope, you get an expander type effect rather than a compression type effect. So having just made some phaser-like effects with a D&B beat, I wanted to try this with this Rhodes and kind of crusty, noisy vinyl type loop. And it's this notch between the kind of low and high pass filter that we're shifting. So by modulating that, modulating the cutoff of a notch filter, and the sounds very much like phasing with some resonance and an LFO to the FM. So here's a kick drum from Neptune. Here's everything but Neptune. And Neptune by itself. Now removing all modulation, this is self-oscillating, just turn the resonance up. Pushing past that, listen to all those harmonics and that pitch shift. We'll come back to that. So tuning this to a kind of suitable range for a kick, I'll start a bit higher just so it's obvious. The longer envelope yellow trace goes into volume. And the blue trace here, which is this orange cable, goes into FM. Tuning this down. Nice deep weighty kick. And then green trace here, this red cable. Listen to the top end, this kind of click and impact. this is going to be a trigger that just pings the high pass input. Hopefully you can hear the difference there. There's just a bit more of a click and a whack up at the front of the sound. And then using a sequence, a bit harder to see, but pink trace here on this blue cable, into resonance, it's going to push this round into these richer sounds. The best thing to watch is probably the red LED there on the resonance. You can see beat 1 in that sequence pushing into more resonant, slightly lower pitched, chunky, flabby, richer sounds. Other drums back in, and a little sequence here. So here we're getting into Neptune as an oscillating filter, working like a VCO, with some FM, AM, built-in wave shaping, pitch effects. Let's pull some cables and go through it from the start. So here we're looking at some salty Neptune acid. Muting the drums that are nothing to do with Neptune. This is again a saw wave into the low pass input. I have two different envelopes, the yellow trace, the volume, blue trace, the filter cutoff. They're playing the same rhythm, but the yellow trace VCA is just slightly longer, letting those filtered notes just ring a bit longer and creating a slightly snappier frequency modulation. Resonance is modulated by the step sequence that's being attenuated externally. Without it, here's just the volume mod, adding the FM of the filter, healthy amount of resonance, backing that off slightly and just opening up the attenuator here for the step sequence modulating resonance. And any kind of resonance modulation can take a bit of dialing in, but hopefully you can hear those. And then I'm audio rate modulating salt and just attenuating here. And this is the same saw wave that's at the input. So saw wave input to low pass, also to salt through an attenuator. And that gives this interesting, really glitchy, croaky character. There's just a bit of salty depths of Neptune acid. So here we'll embrace the chaos, salty chaos. There's now stepped random values to resonance, salt, and FM. So let's explore some audio rate filtering. Taking this green trace, the left-hand oscillator saw wave, into the low pass input. Blue trace is the right-hand oscillator into FM. Yellow trace is the output, and you can see we're imparting these overtones on the wave. LFO to the other FM input. We can add some salt and get really chaotic. That's pretty full on. Neptune will process sub-audio DC signals. You could slew modulation signals. You can create these kind of sub-audio pings that are like kinetic booms, something I've done in videos before. But here I'm using it to create resonating envelopes and injecting wobbles into a stream of modulation. I have an offset voltage coming into frequency modulation, and I've inverted it, attenuated it, with a cutoff up and this particular amount of offset voltage. You can see the output is very much like the input. So turning this down and adding some resonance, much like pinging a filter, these envelope peaks are going to excite this. Creating these kind of resonating envelopes, these wobbly envelopes. The cutoff will affect the speed of that. So turning down resonance, I'm using this blue trace here, which is an attenuated step sequence. I'm going to modulate resonance. So on certain steps, we push up the resonance, create these wobbles that interfere with and mix with this input envelope. So if you've got this far in the video, drop a hard sync in the comments and let me know which one of these was your favourite patches. Head to patreon.com/DivKid to support the work that we do. It makes a huge difference to us still being able to do this. And there's exclusives over there and access to the DivKid Discord community. Hit like and subscribe, it all helps out the channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye.